The Caribbean's calm has shattered, replaced by a tense and volatile atmosphere that has the world holding its breath. Once a region known for its turquoise waters and vibrant cultures, the Caribbean now finds itself at the epicenter of a rapidly escalating crisis. The tranquil beauty of its islands is overshadowed by the looming threat of war, as the eyes of the globe turn to this strategic crossroads. U.S. military strikes on Venezuelan vessels have sent shockwaves through the region, pushing Washington and Caracas dangerously close to open conflict. Warships patrol the turquoise waters, and fighter jets roar overhead, signaling a readiness for confrontation that hasn't been seen in decades. The standoff is not just a test of military might, but a high-stakes gamble with the future of the entire hemisphere. President Trump, addressing the nation and the world, frames the attacks as a decisive crackdown on so-called narco-terrorists. He claims the operation is necessary to protect American lives and interests, painting the U.S. as a force for stability in a region threatened by lawlessness and chaos. The administration insists that these actions are justified, part of a broader campaign to stem the flow of drugs and violence into the United States. In stark contrast, President Nicolas Maduro takes to the airwaves, denouncing the U.S. strikes as blatant imperialist aggression. He calls on Venezuelans to unite, urging civilian militias to prepare for resistance and defend their homeland. Maduro's government accuses Washington of seeking to destabilize Venezuela, rallying the population with fiery speeches and promises to stand firm against foreign intervention. Around the world, governments and citizens alike watch anxiously as the crisis unfolds. Newsrooms buzz with urgent updates, and the United Nations Security Council convenes emergency sessions, desperate to prevent a miscalculation that could ignite a regional war. The stakes are high, and the margin for error is razor-thin. The United States maintains that its strikes are part of a sweeping counter-narcotics operation, accusing Venezuela of harboring drug networks that threaten American security and the stability of neighboring countries. Officials display seized narcotics as evidence, insisting that decisive action is the only way to disrupt these criminal enterprises. But in Caracas, the narrative is very different. The Venezuelan government insists the victims of the strikes were innocent, accusing the U.S. of using the war on drugs as a convenient pretext for regime change and a bid to seize control of Venezuela's vast oil reserves. Grieving families and angry protesters fill the streets, fueling anti-American sentiment and deepening the sense of national crisis. At stake are not just the fates of two nations, but the principles of sovereignty, international law, and the fragile peace of an entire region. As armed forces remain on high alert and diplomats scramble for solutions, the world waits to see whether the Caribbean will become the flashpoint for a new and dangerous era of conflict. On September 2, 2025, the world watched as a U.S. airstrike obliterated a Venezuelan vessel in the Caribbean, killing all 11 people on board. The attack, captured in chilling military footage, sent shockwaves through the region and immediately raised questions about the United States' new approach to maritime threats. The victims, whose identities were never publicly confirmed, became the first casualties in what would soon be recognized as a dramatic escalation in U.S. military policy toward Venezuela and its alleged criminal networks. Within hours, former President Donald Trump, now seeking a return to the White House, took to the airwaves. He claimed full credit for the strike, declaring it a decisive blow against the notorious Tren de Aragua narco-terrorist group. Trump's rhetoric was forceful and uncompromising, framing the operation as a necessary step to protect American interests and stop the flow of drugs and violence from South America. His announcement was met with both applause from supporters and alarm from critics, who questioned the legality and morality of such a sudden, lethal action. Just 2 weeks later, the world was stunned again. Another U.S. airstrike targeted a second boat in the same waters, killing 3 more men. The rapid succession of these attacks signaled that the first strike was not an isolated incident, but rather the opening salvo in a broader campaign. The message was clear: the United States was prepared to use overwhelming force, without warning, against any vessel it suspected of ties to criminal organizations. Despite the gravity of these actions, the U.S. government offered no public evidence to support its claims. There were no photographs of seized contraband, no intercepted communications, and no independent verification of the targets' identities. Instead, the world was left with only the statements of the president and a handful of officials, who insisted that the strikes were justified and necessary for national security. These back-to-back attacks marked a stark departure from previous U.S. policy in the region. The new doctrine was unmistakable: strike first, ask questions later. The Pentagon's willingness to use lethal force without warning or public evidence signaled a far more aggressive stance, one that prioritized rapid action over careful investigation or international consensus. The deployment of the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group to the Caribbean underscored the seriousness of this shift. With its powerful fleet of warships, helicopters, and thousands of Marines, the group's presence marked a major escalation in the region. It sent a clear signal to both allies and adversaries that the United States was prepared to project power and enforce its will, even at the risk of international condemnation. Unlike past interdictions where suspects were often captured and interrogated, these new operations made no attempt to capture or identify the victims before opening fire. The decision to use lethal force as a first resort, rather than a last, raised troubling questions about due process, accountability, and the value of human life in the pursuit of security. Human rights organizations and legal experts quickly condemned the strikes as extrajudicial killings, arguing that they violated international law and set a dangerous precedent. The U.S. government, however, defended its actions as both legal and necessary, insisting that the threat posed by transnational criminal groups justified extraordinary measures. The debate over the morality and legality of these attacks raged in the media and on the world stage. The release of video footage by Trump, showing the moments before and after the strikes, only intensified the controversy. The images, stark and unfiltered, offered a glimpse into the brutal reality of this new phase in U.S. Venezuelan relations, a phase defined by sudden violence, secrecy, and a willingness to cross lines that once seemed unthinkable. Washington insists these strikes are a justified response to a dire threat, vessels allegedly carrying cocaine and fentanyl to U.S. shores. Trump and Secretary of State Rubio brand Venezuela a narco-state, using this narrative to legitimize military force. Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance dismiss legal objections, vowing the strikes will continue as long as needed. The U.S. accuses Maduro of leading the cartel of the Suns, with a $50 million bounty on his head. For Washington, these boats are cartel assets, not just Venezuelan vessels. The war on drugs has become a war on a government. Caracas erupted in outrage. Maduro condemned the strikes as crimes and called for mass enlistment in the Bolivarian militia. The government pressures public workers to join, signaling readiness for a bloody resistance. Venezuela's Air Force buzzed a U.S. destroyer, prompting Trump to threaten retaliation. Diplomatic ties are now in tatters, with both sides escalating militarily and rhetorically. Foreign Minister Gill accused the U.S. of further provocations, warning Venezuela will defend its sovereignty. The standoff leaves no room for dialogue. Both nations brace for a protracted confrontation. The U.S. claims it targeted gang members. Venezuela says the dead were innocent. Leaked U.S. intelligence casts doubt on direct Maduro-Tren de Aragua links, contradicting public rhetoric. DEA and UN data show most cocaine entering the U.S. comes from elsewhere, not Venezuela. Meanwhile, the U.S. increases Venezuelan oil imports even as it attacks Venezuelan boats. The result, a contradictory, confusing policy and a public left in the dark. Legal experts and human rights groups question the strike's legality. No imminent threat, no UN approval, no attempt at apprehension. These are the first overt U.S. military actions in Latin America since Panama, breaking decades of precedent. Critics warn this could destabilize the region and encourage similar actions by other powers. The Trump administration dismisses legal concerns, prioritizing security over international norms. By targeting suspected criminals with military force, the U.S. may have violated the laws of war. The world wonders, will anyone hold America accountable? The strikes unfold amid a U.S. election and years of hostility. Washington refuses to recognize Maduro, citing rigged elections. Trump's tough stance on Latin America is central to his campaign, with dramatic footage of strikes fueling his narrative. The U.S. sees Maduro as a criminal, not a head of state, justifying military action as law enforcement. Yet, economic ties persist. The U.S. quietly increases Venezuelan oil imports. This dual approach, confrontation and engagement, reveals a policy driven by politics, ideology, and necessity. The relationship is more complex and contradictory than ever. The recent U.S. strikes have dramatically escalated tensions in the region, pushing already fragile relations to the very edge. By choosing to act unilaterally, the United States has set a dangerous precedent, one that could encourage other nations to justify preemptive force in the name of security or national interest. This move has sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, raising fears that the established norms of international engagement are being rewritten in real time. Allies and adversaries alike are now watching closely, wondering if this bold action will become the new standard for resolving disputes, or if it will trigger a cycle of retaliation and instability that could spiral out of control. The risk of military miscalculation has never been higher. With both sides deeply entrenched in their positions and official lines of communication now severed, the potential for misunderstanding or accidental escalation looms large. In this environment, even a minor incident could quickly ignite a much larger conflict, drawing in regional powers and threatening the stability of the entire Caribbean basin. Military commanders on both sides are on high alert, forced to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, while the world anxiously watches for any sign of de-escalation. For the United States, this confrontation is framed as a necessary stand against what it calls a criminal regime, an effort to curb illicit activities and restore order. For Venezuela, however, it is nothing less than a battle for sovereignty and national dignity, a fight to resist foreign intervention and defend its right to self-determination. On both sides, the rhetoric is fierce, fueling nationalist sentiment and making compromise increasingly difficult. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, are caught in the crossfire, their lives upended by uncertainty and fear. The situation is further complicated by a lack of clear evidence and conflicting intelligence reports. Analysts and policymakers are left sifting through incomplete data, while the international community debates the legality of the strikes. The apparent disregard for established international law has only deepened global unease, with many leaders expressing concern that the rules-based order is being undermined. The world is left to wonder, are these actions justified, or are they a reckless gamble with far-reaching consequences? Questions abound about the true effectiveness of this approach. Is this really a bold, new strategy in the war on drugs, or simply reckless militarism disguised as policy? Who were the real victims of these strikes, criminals, innocents, or both? With so much information hidden from public view, the truth remains elusive, fueling speculation and mistrust both at home and abroad. These dramatic events have sent ripples through the international system, challenging the very rules that have governed global relations for decades. Nations are now being forced to take sides, weighing their alliances and interests in a rapidly shifting landscape. The United Nations and other international bodies are under pressure to respond, but consensus is elusive as the world grapples with the implications of this new reality. The path forward is anything but clear. Whether this crisis escalates into a broader conflict or finds a peaceful resolution will depend on the choices made in Washington and Caracas in the coming days and weeks. Behind closed doors, diplomats and policymakers are weighing their options, aware that every decision carries enormous risks, not just for their own countries but for the entire region. For now, the Caribbean remains a powder keg, one spark away from disaster. As uncertainty hangs in the air, the world holds its breath, hoping that reason and restraint will prevail over fear and aggression.